Kawankamishnitabog. Nikiti tukum Wunnanumwau Pokonoket Nation. I am Chief Wunnanumwau Tom Frederick of the Chappaquidick Pokonoket Nation right here in beautiful Massachusetts, southeastern quarters. And today we will talk about the Nemasket and what it has meant to my people. This area is rich in history. And not only begins with the first settlers that came in the greeting of Massasoit that befriended the earlier settlers, but also begins to talk about our life and how we interacted with nature and learned to live in harmony. The first settlers coming to this land didn't know much about the area, how to forage it, or even where some of the best resources was. One of the beautiful things, as you can see, is the Nemasket River that's located right here in Middleborough. And for us and our people, we call this Kitat. Kitat means life. It is the center of all hub for our people, in which we would call Sakiana Kiswash, which means the herring, the alewife. And with the changing of each season, we would learn to live in harmony with that. So one of the things that's really important to try to understand about who we are and the original people that inhabit this land is to understand migratory patterns that we would do in relation to the seasons. Each tribe, when you hear the different names such as Chappaquidick, Nemasket, Pokonoket, those represent the geographical territories that traditionally the people would inhabit. Our race would be called the Algonquin people, but we would further break that down by the geographical areas that our families would grow up in. This meant that this would be considered your hometown, but migration played an important role based upon the seasons. So my family, being Chappaquidick or Chappaquidick, would have been on the islands only during the time that was feasible, where fishing and whaling would have been an important part to their history. But once, of course, the winters would set in, we would then seek more protected lands. And one of the places for us was our Pokonoket family that lived in the areas of Betty Neck and as well as Middleborough and some family even in parts of Plymouth, which was called Ep1. The tribes that would have inhabited the Nemasket area was indeed the Nemasket people. The Pocasets further to the south, and the Pokonoket Federation, of which the Pocasets are and of which our tribe is, would have had easy alliances between and opportunities to come together and share. The tribal connections were oftentimes like cousins or distant relatives that would have inhabited those particular tributaries to share in that particular harvest. So we referred to these areas as geographical names. So Lakeville was Azawamset. Middleborough oftentimes referred to as Nemasket. And as I mentioned earlier, Plymouth would have been called Ep1. These particular areas not only were names for the towns, but they represent a specific quality about them that would identify where to find that location. So Nemasket was oftentimes called where the fish can be found, hence referring to the richness of the Nemasket River as it poured from Chappaquidick Pond all the way through Azawamset into the Nemasket Basin and then further on to the Taunton River areas. This was key because as life would sustain itself, these particular tributaries also had strong connections with the Atlantic Ocean. It was not unheard of to see seal or to see sea otters or other animals that would inhabit. So the brackish relationship and interchanging of the salt water and fresh was important to sustain life for us. And so we learned to harvest with that. When you understand the cycles of nature, it is much easier to live in harmony than to fight against it in order to seek out or etch out a living, when Mother Nature will provide if we just listen and learn to be in balance with these things. It is my hope that these series not only provide educational information for people, but teach us something that is very important, that Mother Earth herself is a great teacher. If we just listen, we can all learn to work in harmony and once again restore the balance that operations and resources of pilfering from the land just deplete Mother's resources. The herring one is a gift from Manitou, the Great Spirit, the All-Giver. And because of that relationship, we view the gifts and the abundance that was able to be harvested as part of a holiday, of our cycle of celebration of the gifts of Mother Earth. And so one of the ways that we would often harvest was always in a sustainable way that would provide, never taking more than what was needed to create imbalance, but to encourage the natural cycles of life. And so many of our wares would be utilizing natural resources such as red willow or the different types of woods that were found oftentimes near, and building what we call a ware, which is kind of a trap that would allow the fish to enter right into it without having to cast much effort, and then retrieving that particular basket-like structure that we would harvest our fish. And then in terms of not having refrigeration as we have today, we learned how to preserve fish with processing of different salts, or even in many situations, burying it in the cold ground. Depending upon what era we speak of, the earth had a lot of permafrost, and the further back you go, there is quite indeed evidence that the earth itself was a valuable resource for refrigeration and storing and freezing foods. Hence, many of historians understand the concept of the land bridge, and that whole permafrost and ice age period played an important role. I'd like to also mention that along the Nemasket River, this was also a resource for other forms of life. So the water sources was a prime hunting area. Oftentimes, these particular tributaries were not necessarily geographical tribal areas where many different tribes, with agreements to come onto the land with the tribe, would then in turn provide a community of social harvesting and responsibility. Later on in the season, we would then have our powwows, times where we would have great celebrations, or the word powwow, literally coming from the Algonquin word, in which that we would share the wares, an opportunity to reestablish kinship with families and allies of other tribes, coming together in a form of celebration of feasting and eating. This would oftentimes occur over a 4-day process. And again, you can see the spring, the harvest of the herring. And then as we move into the summer, the celebration of what we obtain from the spring, the sharing of wares and jewelry and exchange, and thereby meeting and understanding who your family ties and kinship were very important. As we approach the fall, the cycle would start over again as we prepared and harvest the corn that we've been growing all summer, preparing for the great harvest, or what we would call Nikomo, the great Thanksgiving feast for us. And this is prior to Thanksgiving, as you know, was a very political issue in the day, but it all was dependent upon the richness of the waters and the rains that would sustain our life cycle. I think the important piece here to remember is that it's all about living in harmony. It's all about living in balance. never taking more than we need, and making sure that we fulfill the promise to the land by being its caretakers, its stewards, so that future generations, 7 generations to come, would also be able to enjoy that resource. Today, we are at a time, a turning point not only in history, but also within the very importance of instability with Mother Earth and her climate. And if we see that if human beings choose to be parasitic to the environment, then we will continue to deplete and destroy those resources. One of the most exciting things is not only the resources that come from the river, but just to give you an idea of how important the Nemasket River played in our lives. The word Nemasket itself comes from the Algonquin word meaning the place where the fish live, as I mentioned earlier. But to break down the word, N-E, the very first parts of the language, refer to the life-giving waters, which we call Ni or Nipi. This particular importance would help us to realize that not only does the water fertilize the vegetation, but it provides a rich and valuable resource of fertilization based upon the refuse of the herring and the fish that would actually go in to fertilize the corn, the asquash, the green beans. This is also known as the Three Sisters. This particular part creates its own ecosystem of plant life that is sustainable and lives in harmony with each other. The corn provides the stalk for the green bean to grow, while the asquash or the squash pumpkin would provide shielding from the burning of the suns and cover the fresh new growth. So once again, while people would observe this natural cycle of life, and it is that observance that helped us to create how to live in harmony and thereby creating sustainability as Mother Earth would teach us her natural ways. What many people don't realize is that a lot of the roots that are naturally within the areas such as the old 104, 106, 105, 44, all of those particular areas were indeed old travel routes that would have allowed us to get back and forth. Now these things would have taken us anywhere from basically a day's travel to maybe 2 days, depending on how far inland we would travel to go. But what sped up that opportunity for just walking by foot would have been traveled by what we call mishun. Mishun are the canoes that we would use to travel the waterways, and the tributaries and the waters itself would provide incredible opportunities for to get quicker from one location to the next. The second thing that would be equally important is that depending upon the proliferation of the rain, how wet the season was, the height of it, did it flood, did it recede, did we have enough waters, would also play an important role on the bounty that would come for the fall. Why was all of this important? Well, the winters back then were oftentimes very harsh, much harsher than what we experience today. And so what we would see is that not only was there a need to prepare for the long moon, which we would call it, but would be a time for us to make sure that we had stored not only for ourselves and individual families, but for the whole tribe and the people itself. And that's where the concept of our dwellings, the we-two, came into play. the dwellings were oftentimes based upon the number of sacred fires that we would have within them. A single witu would be one family fire, but a niswitu might be two fires within a given dwelling, and it might encompass 2 to 3 different families. And then the great house, the long house, which is what the word aso means, is the concept of a community dwelling where meetings might be held, but could indeed actually hold anywhere from 5 to 7 families within this, coming together to survive the harsh winters. One of the most important things that we must do is not only give thanks to our viewers and our listeners and to Lake Cam itself for doing this incredible opportunity for us to tell our story, but to give thanks also to the great Nemasket River for the life-giving abundance that for centuries has provided this land with, both then and as we bridge a future into tomorrow. And so stand with me as I say, tabatantom manitu, tabatantom ni. Aho. And in our language, we do not say goodbye. We merely say, doksha, akwini, till we meet again. Nikiti tokum, Wunnanumwau Tom Frederick. Aho. I am Chief Tom Frederick of the Chappaquidick Pokonoket. Till then, my friends.